Great. Thanks, Darren. Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully you've got a nice cup of tea or coffee or a piece of food in front of you. So, as Darren said, my name is Beau. I'm the National Program Manager for Pride in Sport Australia. Our main purpose at Pride in Sport is to provide assistance and guidance to sporting organisations at all different levels around the inclusion of LGBTI plus people in sport. To give you a bit of context, I wanted to start with is just to show you the breadth of work that we're doing with a number of different organisations, and I won't go through that in detail, but you can see on there that there's a number of national sporting bodies which are a part of our program, as well as some state sporting bodies and elite clubs as well. We also have a strong partnership with Sport Australia, the National Sports Convention, and I see a few familiar faces of people that were down there last week. We had the ability to speak about this program across the country to a number of different organisations. And we also have the ability to engage with subject matter experts when it comes to legal aspects. So the Human Rights Commission are a key partner of ours, as well as organisations such as Play by the Rules and Sports Community, which I have no doubt that many of you have heard of. So Pride in Sport as a program is broken up into three different areas, three key spaces. The first of which is the Pride in Sport Index, which I'll speak to in a little bit more detail in a moment. The second of which is our membership program, which those are the logos which you saw in there before. So sporting organisations can come to us and pay us a fee where we can offer them services, and I'll explain a little bit more about that down the track. And we also have the Australian Pride in Sport Awards, which some of you may or may not have heard of. These are a national awards evening which we run once a year. And we recognise the efforts and services that people, individuals, as well as organisations at all different levels have done in this space. In addition to those three, we also run a conference which is held in November every year. This year, for the first time, it's actually going to be held in Sydney. You can find out more details about that, or I can talk to you later. And one interesting one, which not many people know of, we also co-host the LGBTI Inclusive Employers website. So to give you a very brief summary of that, if you're a person who identifies as gay, lesbian, trans, intersex, you can go to this website and you can actually see the employers that have done work in the space of LGBTI inclusion, and they've actually proven that they have an inclusive environment for you to go and work for them. And there are a number of sporting organisations with the likes of Rugby Australia, FFA, and Water Polo Australia, which are currently on that website. So the Pride in Sport Index. So Darren mentioned at the very start that there's something that we have which is for free, and that is the index itself. So this is something which the sporting community may not have necessarily heard a little bit about. It's something which is used quite a lot in the corporate sector, and we've now translated this into the sporting scene. So the index itself is a national benchmarking tool that measures your inclusion when it comes to LGBTI people. Oh yeah, and it's free. That's the biggest thing I want to make sure I emphasise whenever I talk about this to a number of sporting organisations, because I get it. I've worked in sport pretty much my entire life. I worked for an SSO here in New South Wales, and I heard the little conversations at the start. I was actually on the national management team of Good Sports for the last 8 years before I came into this role in the last 6 months. So having something for free, I think, is really important. So how does it help? The index covers off all these different areas. So we start off with governance and strategy, and essentially you're given a piece of paper, or you're given a document where you go through and you answer lots of different questions. Some questions will require you to input details around evidence and stuff that you've done within that space. Others will actually guide you into areas that you may not necessarily have thought about doing work in, that the index can assist you in that space. So when it comes to governance and strategy, we support organisations kickstart by developing a simple strategy that lets you put in place some targets and some goals that you'd like to achieve. And we can also help you if you haven't got the capacity to go into all these different areas as well when it comes to developing policies, creating more inclusive workplaces for your staff, not just your athletes, as well as a range of different areas when it comes to promotion of your policies and governance. Education, so the one in the middle is probably one of our other biggest areas. That's where myself or one of my staff members would come into your organisation and deliver LGBTI training of different types whether that be to your staff members or your athletes. We can do ones where we've done some in the past where we've invited club presidents along. Some sports might have like a state conference where we can go along and talk to your clubs about that and give them helpful tips about what some of the things are that they can do in this space as well. Excuse me. We also can assist you in the terms of education, so for resources as well. It's really important for a sporting organisation, in particular an SSO, to have something on their website that points people in the direction of where they can find more information. The one thing I learnt quite quickly, I mentioned before, I started in this job in January this year. And when I started speaking to sporting organisations, and the majority of which are either national or state bodies, it was interesting. I'd go up to them and say, I want to talk to you about LGBTI inclusion. And you know what their first response was? They're just like, oh yeah, we're inclusive. We're happy to have gay people come along and play in our sports. And, you know, our whole women's team is full of lesbians. Some of you might cringe at that, but that was actually said in a nice way. And the fact I'm sure a lot of you can relate in the sense that you like to believe, and I certainly like to believe that sport in Australia as a whole is an inclusive environment. But when the reality comes to it, a lot of the emphasis actually comes in the context and the background and actually showing people what you've done in this space. So it's not necessarily having a rainbow flag and waving it and saying, we're inclusive, come and play our sport, don't play with them because they're not waving this flag. It's not that at all. It's actually about having the governance and the support behind you to show people of an LGBTI community that you are inclusive and that you are there to support them. Same goes with all the other inclusion sectors, so like disability, COLD and Indigenous as well. The framework between those areas is actually very, very similar. The index also goes into the visibility, so that is the rainbow waving, rainbow flag waving. We can help you in terms of emphasising your work that you've done, participating in days of significance, and I'm sure plenty of you have heard of things like Ida Hobbit or Wear It Purple Day. Those sorts of things are all related to the LGBTI community. We can also assist you when it comes to media contributions, so actually going to media outlets and supporting them, and providing them with details of either events that you've done in this space or particular announcements around your governance. A good example of this is there's a number of sports just this weekend gone where they delivered a Pride Cup. Some sports have the capacity where they have a round where they dedicate it to a rainbow round or an LGBTI round. Same as plenty of other sports would also do an Indigenous round. Very similar sorts of things to that. On the far right-hand side, we talk about engagement. So this is mostly around community engagement. Again, most sporting organisations would have a little bit of capacity to provide assistance and even attend different events. So if we're talking about your local community clubs, they might have a local fair day, for example, where they would go along and try and get people to sign up for their sport. One thing that we do in this space is to try and encourage them to put something in that space, whether it be on their flyer or a banner or something that's in their stall, to actually show that they are inclusive, because there's quite a lot of LGBTI people, and in fact, quite a lot of mums and dads of LGBTI youth that are trying to find a sport that is showing that they're inclusive. And it's interesting, I don't think there's a week gone by in the last 3 or 4 months where I haven't had a parent call me and say, have you got a directory of sports that are LGBTI inclusive? I just don't know where to send my little boy or my little girl. And we don't have a directory. It's as simple as that, because at this stage, LGBTI inclusion in sport is still quite a new thing. So hopefully over time we will have something in that space beyond that LGBTI inclusion employer's website. We also help in terms of things like sponsorship, and I mentioned before that I did quite a lot of work over the last 8 or 9 years around good sports, and when I used to sell good sports, people would say the same thing. It's like, oh, well, you're coming to tell us to change our ways in alcohol and drugs, but what am I getting out of it? What money are you going to give me? And we don't have any money to give you. It's as simple as that. But by doing work in this space, it will actually make you more viable to getting sponsorships from other organisations that like to align their values with a sporting organisation. And a good example in this space is if you use the likes of Qantas and Rugby Australia. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the different things that have been in the media of particular individuals that will be nameless in this session. But that's a really good example in terms of Qantas are actually looking for a sporting organisation that has very similar values to them. Now, I know that's a national example, and the majority of you in this room here are from state sporting bodies, but the exact same goes at state level and even further down as well. There's quite a lot of local car yards, for example, which have similar values in this particular space, and they want to align their organisation with a sporting organisation who has the same values and principles. So work in that space is also really important. The final part of this, the index itself, is around research. The PSI survey, so PSI stands for Pride in Sport, if you haven't got that one already. The PSI survey is something which we coordinate with sporting organisations that like to participate. Again, it's free, and it is optional as well, so you don't have to do this. The index itself is something that you complete a document and you provide evidence on work that you've done. The survey is actually a link that you send out to whatever group of individuals in your sport that you like, and you gauge their perception and their opinions of what you've done in this space. And there's a range of different questions which will actually correlate back to all of this work so that you can compare what you've actually done compared to what people's beliefs are in your sport. And if I go on some examples from last year, I can't name the sports, but there was an organisation last year which did amazing work in the governance and strategy space. They put in annual KPIs, they developed an inclusion policy and did a range of different things. They scored really well when it came to the marking of the index itself, and they decided to do the survey. They sent it out to their membership base, and wouldn't you know it, the membership came back and said, no, we don't believe they're doing anything in this space. So, and that's not public either, that's just for the organisation to be aware of. Now it's interesting because you as an organisation can then actually compare and say, well, we know that we're doing work in this space, we know that we've developed an inclusion policy, why don't our members know about this? And so we can actually assist you in that space once we identify or can work out the correlation or the non-correlation between some of these spaces, we can assist and do a little bit more work in that space. The new index, which should actually be released in the next week or two. So we basically go off a 3-year basis, and then we change the index up a little bit based on international and national standards and benchmarking. The new one's actually going to be defined within, or the questions will be defined in 3 different categories. So foundation, intermediate and advanced. The reason why we've brought this in is because we now want to actually encourage grassroots community organisations to also participate in this index. Traditionally, the first index, which was released about 4 or 5 years ago, was targeted mainly towards national and state sporting bodies. Now that we know that community organisations are also doing work in this space, we want them to have a tool that they can measure their own success. So every section within this index basically has a question that is relatable whether you're a NSO, SSO or a grassroots club. So for most of the grassroots clubs, if you want to encourage all of your affiliates to do it, you can push them and say, look, what you need to be doing is anything in the foundation space. As an SSO, I would probably say over time, once you start to do a little bit of work in this space, you'd be pushing towards the intermediate side of things. And then the NSOs and even SSOs that are doing extremely well in this space, and I'll use the Victorian example because I like competition. Cricket Victoria are the leading state sporting organisation in the country at the moment when it comes to LGBTI inclusion. So any cricket people in the room today, you've got a challenge ahead of you. So that's a little bit about the index. The index, like I said, it's free. You can get on, you can do that. Index submissions, so it's based on a calendar year. You can submit your index to us by December or January, and you get your results back shortly after that. If you get your index results back, or even if you want to start doing a little bit of extra work with us before then, you can look at the membership side of things. At the moment, there's 3 different tiers of membership. For most of you, I dare say you'd probably be looking at the small employer, which is basically your entry-level membership tier. And we're also about to release a community organisation, so that's for volunteers only, so your grassroots clubs, any of your affiliates. We're working towards a similar sort of model to Good Sports, and we're actually doing a little bit of work with Play by the Rules and Sports Community to try and develop some best template policies and templates that we can give these organisations at a much cheaper cost for us. The benefits, depending on what tier that you come on, would be 24-hour support, Crisis support if you're the likes of dealing with rugby union players that like to put up posts on social media. Admin, telephone, email support, all of those sorts of things. You also have the ability to come along to our LGBTI roundtables, and we have those every quarter, and in Sydney we have them every quarter. And they're based on different themes depending on what the market requires or what you yourselves as organisations want to learn a little bit more about. Now, the roundtables are member-only benefits, and the reason for that is because we like to create a safe space where if you're a member of Pride in Sport, you can come along and you can actually start talking with other sporting bodies. So if you're all NSOs in the room today, come along to our roundtable and actually have the ability to network and talk with other SSOs and say, look, we haven't done anything in this space, for the intersex community. What are you doing? Or what can we do together to do a little bit more in this space? I know in sport, we like to think of ourselves as very competitive, and sometimes we don't like to share things with other sporting bodies. But when it comes to inclusion, whether that be LGBTI, Indigenous, disability, cold, etc., this is something that is really important that we do start to work together. Because at the end of the day, it means that we're providing that better environment for LGBTI people to come on board. I mentioned before around the capacity side of things, which is really interesting, and again, having previously worked in an SSO, I knew we had a few staff where we had a little bit of capacity to do some stuff. But I also know that there's a number of SSOs which are even based at Sports House where they just have one staff person. So I get not every organisation will have the capacity to do everything within that index. And that's where we like to think that we can come in. So if you're an organisation that has the capacity to do a few things yourselves, but you'd just like us to come in and deliver some simple training, and it might be LGBTI awareness training for your staff, your board, or some of your club executives, we can do that. Or if you want us to actually come in and completely write your inclusion policy and your strategy and your framework for you, we can do that as well. We like to tailor everything specific for your needs because we recognise that everyone is at different levels. So please bear that in mind as well. I mentioned very briefly before the Australian Pride in Sport Awards. I think it's really important that we acknowledge and recognise people that are doing work in this space, hence why we started this a few years ago. So the awards are a little bit different to most awards, and I'm sure most of you know about the awards that Sport New South Wales do, for example. Our awards are actually categorised in two different streams, the first of which are based on the results from your index. So that slide where we had all that stuff up there and I did the different explanations. So your submission will actually be the basis of whether you achieve an award or not in that area. We also have community-based nominations as well, and there's a number of different ones for your LGBTI champions, different allies that might be doing something in this space or within your sport, as well as community sporting clubs themselves. So last year, and actually I think I can... Yeah, I'll show you a couple of examples we've got on here. So if we look at the index-based results, the leading organisations, and it was a tie this year for the first time ever, was between Tennis Australia and Melbourne University Sport, which are a member of Pride in Sport. Now, you might find it interesting that a university sport is at the same level as an NSO, but the reality is that they achieve the same result, but they're doing... not totally, but they're doing very different things. And you can see a couple of the key points in here in terms of Tennis Australia actually have a best practice when it comes to community engagement. If you follow tennis, you may have heard during the Australian Open at the start of this year, they ran the Glam Slam, which was an LGBTI tournament which ran in conjunction with the Grand Slam down in Melbourne. Funny, I know, right? And in Melbourne, when it comes to... governance for them, that's where they're really strong. So they've actually got a very strong homophobia policy in place that addresses homophobia, rather. And they also have amazing internal visibility. So I mentioned before, yes, they wave the rainbow flag, but they also have a number of different pages on their website which are dedicated to the different letters in the acronym of LGBTI. So they're going above and beyond, a perfect example for that. When it comes to grassroots clubs, Perth Pythons are probably one of the leaders in this space. Excuse me. For them, it was a hockey organisation in Perth which was developed and actually started because a number of people weren't satisfied with the other hockey clubs or the other sports that they participated in when it came to being an inclusive place for LGBTI people. So they started their own. It's been in place now for about 10 years. And their motto for them is "Everyone is welcome." Unlike quite a lot of clubs across the country, at their tennis courts they have a flagpole, but on that flagpole for 52 weeks of the year is the rainbow flag that actually flies. Now, it's not an LGBTI specific club. 50% of their members would be classed as allies or straight people. But they go to that club because they just know it's a fun and exciting place to be, but they also know that they can go there no matter what they look like and how they feel. All those nice things we like to hear when we talk about gym membership. We're just like, well, we don't want to be, picked on and anything like that. So Perth Pythons have done amazing in that space. It's interesting, one of the good examples that they did too, and we talk about the capacity of a community club, was in 2018 they had a Have a Go Day, where I'm sure most sports would have something like this, where they invite people to come along and try their sport out. But this one was actually specifically aimed at recruiting LGBTI allies, because they had a large LGBTI base of members at that particular point in time, but they wanted to increase their membership. And they said, well, allies, straight people are you look at the marriage equality campaign, regardless of what side of the debate you're on, the majority of people in this country do consider themselves an ally. So they saw that niche, that little bit of a niche in that market, and they took advantage of that, and their membership has skyrocketed because of it. This is the list of the other award winners for this year's Pride in Sport Awards, which were held in June, so not too long ago. So I mentioned that Melbourne University Sport and Tennis Australia are at the top. They're leading this space in all sports across the country at the moment. It's also interesting, I should have pointed out before, so Tennis Australia is obviously just tennis. Melbourne University Sport is 40 different sports. They have 40 different sporting clubs that they administer and manage, like many universities across the country. But it's amazing to see that, for me, I kind of use that as an example as saying, if you don't think that your sport can do something in space, well, Melbourne Uni Sport is an example. They're doing it with 40 sports all at once. I mentioned the highest ranking SSO at the moment across the country is Cricket Victoria. Professional club is St Kilda Football Club, closely followed by the likes of Sydney Swans. I'm sure many of you would have heard that their Pride round, which they have, it's coming up in a few weeks actually at the SCG. And then we go into those community-based awards that I mentioned. So you've got LGBTI Ally, an inclusive coach, community sport, out role model, an inclusion initiative or program that might be running, as well as that award for the small club. So there's a range of different ways that you can get people involved and get them recognised for the work that they do. So if I had to give you 2 action items after today, the first of which would be do the index. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do it. And I know that, and I'm saying that very aggressively in the sense that even if you're a one-man band that's running your sport, there is no reason why you shouldn't be doing the index. It's free. The new iteration has, I think it's like 36 questions. That's not a lot when it comes to wanting to find out how inclusive your sport is. The benefit of doing the index year on year as well is the fact that the idea of being a benchmarking tool that you can actually compare where you started this year. And don't be afraid, most people when they start off quite low, around 0, 1, 2 or 3 points out of 100. That's quite common, so don't be afraid of that. The biggest thing for you is to take that first step and to recognise that you want to do something in this space. And the beauty, like I said, the benchmarking side of things, is you can compare year on year. You can go back to your board members and say, look, we started in 2019 and we got 0, but now in 2020 we've got 5 or we've got 10, and we're gradually working to continually improve. And we're now looking at membership with Pride in Sport so they can help us write our policies and those sorts of things. So do the index. Go to the website, prideinsport.com.au. Like I said, it'll be released in about a week or 2. And if you want, I'm happy to take your business cards, or you can take mine, which are on the table over there later, and I can send you an email and let you know once it's all out. The second of which, like I said earlier, you can do right now, or you can wait until your index results come through, more than happy to, is look at membership. The membership tiers obviously do cost money, but it does come back to the fact that you need to consider it as an investment. If you want to show people in the community that you're LGBTI inclusive, you need to put your money where your mouth is. It's interesting, Darren and I were at the National Sports Convention last week, and we had a speaker from, I think it was Golf Australia, and I loved the quote. I used a quote that she said in her session, in the fact that if your leader's not inclusive, then your sport's not inclusive. And that is so true. And I've only got to look at that list of organisations which are doing really well in this space, and their leaders are the reason because of that. So if you're not the CEO or the general manager or one of the senior executive team members here today, that's okay. The one thing I would say is go back to them and encourage them to either meet with me or contact me, and likewise we can work together to see what we can do for your sport in this space. But the membership side of things I think is really important, particularly if you want to be that leader in this space. There's so many sports which are trying to do well in this area, and even like those other pillars that I mentioned before, so the likes of disability, Indigenous, the framework is very similar. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't be doing anything in this area. Aside from that, that's pretty much it for me presentation-wise. So no, I think I'm a little bit early. I didn't get the 5-minute warning, so. But I'm really keen to actually answer any questions that any of you might have, because like I said, I know this is different to the other presentations you had this morning, and this is sort of an area which I know some of you would be very comfortable working in, others might have different questions or concerns. And I think we've got a bit of time, so I'm happy to take questions from the floor if anyone has any.
How long are the awareness workshops that you run?
Depending on what line. So if we're looking at the 101, which we call LGBTI awareness training, can be anywhere between an hour and 2 hours. For most of them, about an hour and a half. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right, I'll ask a question. What do you do if you have someone who identifies as transgender and comes to your sport and says, I'm transgender, I'd love to play your particular sport, but I notice over here you've only got male and female toilets. Where can I go? What do you think the answer would be? Come on, you've all thought about it, I know. Pretty much, yeah. So it's. I'm really glad you kind of said that. Well, not necessarily wherever you want. Let's probably just put that right now, okay? We don't want to go and, right on the field or anything. In a nutshell, the Anti-Discrimination Act and funny enough, I think there's a few other different acts in there, basically say that as to not discriminate, if you're a transgender man, then you should be allowed to use the facility that you best identify with. Likewise, if you're a transgender woman, then you should be able to use the women's facilities. In sport, however, not however, but it's just a common thing, whether it's sport in Australia or sport across the world, you'll always have those skeptics that will be concerned. And, we hear in the media every now and then that, people are worried about transgender women in particular going into toilets because they might abuse children and those sorts of things, like all those horrible sorts of stories. But it's interesting that the statistics that we do know about is that the people who are actually abused and assaulted more in toilets are transgender women as opposed to anybody else. Not everyone knows that. One suggestion we do like to recommend for people, and it's not a possibility at every single sport, I get that, because it depends on your particular facilities, is that it would actually be a good idea to have a gender-neutral toilet. Now, for most of you, you've probably got a disabled toilet at your club or your office, right? Disabled toilets themselves are gender-neutral to begin with, but they're not labelled as such. A quick fix, probably not the right terminology, but I'll use it anyway. A quick fix that I would recommend to you is if you go back to, whether it be your office or any of the sporting clubs that you're working with, if they have a disabled toilet and it's just got the picture of that disabled picture on the front door, get them to change that and to show that it's disabled/gender neutral. That is actually the legal recommendation and the advice from the Australian Building Code that recommend that you do that. So if you're building a new facility, you actually have to do that anyway. But for quite a lot of us, we're all working and playing in older facilities. So that would be a quick example that I'd say. Yeah.
So this is excellent. What I'm interested in is there's a lot of sports trying to work better in culturally diverse communities. And when you get culturally diverse and pride in sport, there can be parallels, but there can also be a lot of tensions. There are gay and lesbians in every community. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but there's also issues that can rub up against each other.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. At this stage, we're probably limited to, I guess, best practice because there hasn't been a lot done, whether it be from our organisation or any of the others. For the most part, I think we use the framework very similar to what we would do with Indigenous in terms of starting off having those conversations and finding out what's culturally appropriate for us to do in that space. And it's interesting, I'm working with a sporting organisation at the moment up in Newcastle, and they're just starting to explore that space. And they had a conversation last week, and they said, "Oh, yeah, exactly that." In terms of, well, what happens if we have a group of membership that come from a cultural background, such as I don't know, anywhere in the Midwest or anywhere in Europe for that matter. Excuse me. So how do we make sure that we're sensitive to both parts but pleasing them at the same time? And there's not a perfect answer. And the only thing that people came back to was the fact that start the conversations and find out what people would actually be okay with. I'd be interested to try and get some more case studies. So if you've got an example for me to try. Okay, there you go. So you're just finding out what everybody else in the world's doing. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. No, the best example I've got in that sort of space would be engaging with the people on both sides. So if you've got, particularly if they're comfortable with it, obviously, people within your sport that identify as LGBTI, and likewise people who identify from a different culturally or linguistically diverse background, encourage them to get together and say, look, we both want to do something in space. What's something that we can do on the LGBTI side that would be okay and not offend you, and vice versa. And then send me an email, let me know what works. Yeah.
Until such times as we've updated these inclusion policies and all that, I mean, is there a reference that we can, as an SSO, on how we can manage like dispute resolution? So it's all relatively, I guess new if we come to these issues, especially.
Yeah. Very good question. When it comes to trans and gender diverse people, many of you may have known about the launch that Sport Australia did recently, and they've got a new booklet, Transgender Diverse Guidelines for people in sport. Within that, there is an example process that you can follow. But for the most part, when even the majority of NSOs at this point in time, they're still using their current disciplinary process within their MPP or the codes of conduct. The only thing I would say is if you're using those existing processes, it doesn't have to be formally, but even if you've got an issue that arises within this space, reach out for subject matter experts, and that can be me or it can be a number of other LGBTI community organisations around, and get their advice as to what is appropriate, and even going down to things like what language you should be using when it comes to sending a letter to say, please come to a judiciary, like those sorts of things. And a simple one too is removing the likes of pronouns or finding out what people's pronouns are. So if we're talking about transgender diverse people, for example, I'm a cisgender man, which is I identify with the gender I was given at birth, being a male. So my pronouns are he, him, his. Some of the ladies in the room, your pronouns might be she, her, hers. Whereas a gender diverse person or a non-binary individual in particular, for the most part, most of their pronouns are they, them, theirs. And it can actually be very insensitive for someone of that particular background if you're using the incorrect language. It's not to say that you're doing it intentionally, of course, but it's just those little things that we can do to improve. But yeah, if you're using an existing one, I'd say reach out to the subject matter experts. Are we going over now? Sorry.
Can you please thank
Pleasure.
Please.
Thank you.